The world just quietly rewired its financial plumbing, and most Americans are still sleeping. We're not talking about a recession. We're not talking about a stock market correction. We're not talking about some crypto bubble or a housing dip. We are talking about something that happens once every 50 to 80 years. A restructuring so deep, so fundamental, that when it's over, the rules of money, the rules of power, and the rules of who holds leverage over who are completely different from before. And it has already started. Not 5 years from now. Not eventually. Right now. In boardrooms in Beijing, in central bank vaults in Riyadh, in financial ministry meetings in Moscow, New Delhi, and Dubai, the architecture of global money is being rebuilt, brick by brick, deal by deal. And Washington, D.C. is either too distracted, too arrogant, or too deep in its own fiscal mess to notice. Stay with me through this video, because by the end of it, you will understand something that most financial commentators either don't fully grasp or don't want to say out loud. Before we go any further, if you're new here, subscribe right now. We don't do clickbait. We do financial analysis backed by hard numbers. And drop in the comments, do you think America is prepared for a world where the dollar is no longer the king? I read every single response. Now let's get into it. First, let's establish what we actually mean by a monetary reset, because that term gets thrown around loosely and most people using it don't fully understand what they're describing. A monetary reset is not when a country devalues its currency. It's not when the Fed raises interest rates. A true monetary reset is a structural shift in the global financial order. Who controls the reserve currency, who sets the rules of international trade, and what asset backs the world's confidence in money itself. We have seen exactly two of these in modern history. The first was 1944, the Bretton Woods Agreement. After World War II, 44 nations gathered in New Hampshire and agreed the US dollar would be the world's reserve currency, pegged to gold at $35 per ounce. Every other currency would be pegged to the dollar. America became the financial center of the planet, not because everyone loved the US, but because it held the most gold, the most industrial capacity, and the most stable government at the time. The second reset was 1971, the Nixon shock. President Nixon unilaterally ended the dollar's convertibility to gold. Overnight, the entire world's monetary system shifted from a commodity-backed standard to a system backed purely by trust in the United States government. That is the system we are living in right now. A dollar in your pocket is not backed by gold. It is backed by the full faith and credit of the US, meaning the world has to keep believing America will manage its finances responsibly. Here is the critical question every American should be asking right now in 2026. Is that faith still justified? Look at the numbers, and I'm going to give you the real numbers, not the political spin. As of April 2026, total U.S. gross national debt has crossed $38.98 trillion. That number is growing at a rate of approximately $7.58 billion per day. Every hour, $315 million is added to the national debt. Every minute, $526 million. That translates to roughly $289,000 of debt per American household. But the debt number alone doesn't capture the severity. What matters more is what it costs to just service that debt. In fiscal year 2025, the U.S. government paid $1.22 trillion in interest on the national debt alone. That's not paying down the debt. That is just the interest. For context, that figure nearly doubled in just 3 fiscal years, jumping from approximately $500 billion in 2022 to over $1.2 trillion in 2025. Right now, interest payments are the second largest spending category of the entire federal government, second only to Social Security. America is spending more on debt interest than on Medicare, more than on national defense, more than on education, infrastructure, and veterans combined. Think about what that means structurally. The U.S. government already spends more than it collects, even before counting interest payments, what economists call a primary deficit, and then interest is stacked on top of that. The Congressional Budget Office projects this will only get worse. By 2035, interest payments alone could exceed $1.8 trillion per year. These are not partisan talking points. These are numbers straight from the GAO, the CBO, and the U.S. Treasury itself. Now ask yourself, if you were a foreign central bank holding trillions of dollars in U.S. Treasury bonds, watching these numbers unfold year after year, would you be increasing your exposure to American debt, or would you be quietly looking for alternatives? Stay right here. Because what I'm about to show you is the real-time evidence that those foreign central banks have already made their decision, and they are actively acting on it as we speak. Here is a fact that should stop you cold. In 1977, the US dollar represented approximately 85% of all global foreign exchange reserves. That means nearly every central bank on earth kept the overwhelming majority of its savings in American dollars. Today, according to the IMF's own official database for global reserve currency composition, the dollar's share has declined to approximately 57%. The Federal Reserve's own 2025 report confirms the dollar peaked at 72% of reserves in 2001 and has been falling ever since. That is a decline of nearly 15 percentage points in 25 years. And critically, the pace of that decline has been accelerating since 2021. If the current rate of decline continues, the dollar's share falls below 50% before 2035. Between 2015 and 2025, the average USD share in total reserves, when you include gold as part of the picture, declined by 12%. The share of gold in those same reserves increased by 8%. And that brings us to gold, because this is where the signal becomes impossible to ignore. In 2015, gold represented less than 10% of official global reserve assets held by central banks. By 2025, according to the Federal Reserve's own research, that share has more than doubled to over 23%. In January 2026, a milestone was quietly crossed that almost nobody covered with the urgency it deserved. For the first time in modern financial history, gold overtook U.S. Treasury securities as a share of global central bank reserve assets. Let that land for a second. The most conservative, most data-driven, most risk-averse institutions on the planet, the world's central banks, are now holding more gold than American government debt in their reserves. They are choosing a metal over a treasury bond. That is not a speculative move. That is a verdict on the trajectory of American fiscal credibility. In 2024 alone, central banks globally added 1,045 metric tons of gold to their reserves. That was the third consecutive year that annual purchases exceeded 1,000 metric tons. The World Gold Council's 2025 Central Bank Gold Survey found that 76% of central bank respondents expect gold to account for a higher share of their reserves within 5 years, up from 69% the prior year. Among emerging market central banks specifically, 48% plan to actively increase their gold holdings in the coming year. When asked why, the motivations cited were historical stability, crisis performance, and the absence of default risk. And here is the phrase that matters most. The head of central banks at the World Gold Council described it plainly as a desire to diversify reserves away from traditional currencies. They are not whispering this. They are publishing it in annual surveys. The monetary reset isn't a theory. The first phase of it is already in the data, in IMF databases, Federal Reserve reports, and Treasury statements. It's not hidden, it's just not being discussed with the urgency it deserves. The United States has run on a remarkable structural advantage for 80 years. Because the dollar is the world's reserve currency, America has been able to run massive deficits, borrow cheaply, and finance its entire way of life partly on the back of foreign demand for its treasury bonds. Economists call this the exorbitant privilege, a term coined by French Finance Minister Valéry Giscard d'Estaing back in the 1960s, when France was already warning that America was getting an unfair free ride from the system. That privilege rests on a single foundation: the world's trust that the dollar is safe, stable, and free from political weaponization. The dollar's reserve share is now at a 31-year low. Interest payments on U.S. debt just crossed $1.2 trillion for the first time in history, and central banks are buying gold at the fastest sustained pace in decades. Not because gold is fashionable, but because something else is losing its appeal. We established the foundation. The dollar's reserve share is at a 31-year low. Interest payments on U.S. debt just surpassed $1.2 trillion in a single year for the first time in history. And central banks worldwide are buying gold at the fastest sustained pace in decades. That is the backdrop. Now let's talk about what is actively being built to replace the dollar's dominance. Because this is where it gets deeply uncomfortable for anyone invested in the idea that American financial supremacy is permanent. Let's start with the moment most Americans completely missed. On June 9, 2024, a joint economic cooperation commission between the United States and Saudi Arabia, originally established in June 1974, quietly expired. Saudi Arabia did not renew it. Now, to understand why this matters, you need to understand what that 1974 arrangement actually meant for the global financial system. When President Nixon ended dollar-gold convertibility in 1971 and the Bretton Woods system collapsed, the U.S. dollar had a serious problem. It was no longer backed by anything tangible. So Henry Kissinger engineered a solution. The United States struck a deal with Saudi Arabia, the world's largest oil exporter at the time. The arrangement was simple in concept and world-changing in consequence. Saudi Arabia would price its oil exclusively in U.S. dollars, and in return, America would provide military protection and security guarantees. Other OPEC nations followed. Overnight, every country on Earth that needed oil, which was every country on Earth, needed dollars to buy it. The dollar didn't need gold anymore. It had oil. That is the petrodollar system. And it is what has underwritten American financial dominance for 50 years. In 2023, Saudi Arabia and China signed a $7 billion currency swap agreement. Saudi Arabia joined BRICS. And in 2024, that 50-year arrangement with the U.S. expired without renewal. China has now displaced the United States as Saudi Arabia's largest oil customer. The economic gravity has shifted. As one economist who studies Gulf energy markets put it plainly, China consumes approximately 15 to 16 million barrels of oil per day, roughly 15% of total global consumption. When your biggest customer pays in yuan, the logic of pricing everything in dollars starts to break down. The door to selling oil in non-dollar currencies is now open. That door was closed for 50 years. This is not a conspiracy theory. This is a documented structural shift in the energy market that underpins the entire rationale for dollar dominance. Now, let's talk about SWIFT, because this is where it gets even more serious. SWIFT, the Society for Worldwide Interbank Financial Telecommunication, is the global messaging network that processes international money transfers. Nearly every cross-border transaction on Earth runs through it, and the United States effectively controls it. When Washington wants to financially isolate a country, it removes them from SWIFT. Iran was removed. Venezuela was targeted. And in February 2022, following Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the U.S. and its allies took the most dramatic step yet. They froze approximately $300 billion of Russia's central bank foreign exchange reserves. $300 billion. Gone. Inaccessible overnight. That had never been done to a G20 economy in history. Now, here is the unintended consequence that nobody in Washington seems to have fully calculated. When you freeze the reserves of a major economy, not a small rogue state, but a G20 nation, every other central bank on Earth takes note, because every central bank that holds dollar-denominated assets is now looking at the same question. If it happened to Russia, under what conditions could it happen to us? That is not paranoia. That is rational institutional risk management. A Bank for International Settlements survey found that many emerging market central banks are quietly diversifying reserves specifically as insurance against political exposure. The weaponization of the dollar, using financial access as a geopolitical weapon, has given dozens of nations a concrete, practical reason to build alternatives. Not because they hate America, because they understand that financial neutrality, once broken, cannot be assumed again. And those alternatives, they are already being built. Right now, China's cross-border interbank payment system, CIPS, was designed as an alternative to SWIFT for yuan-based transactions. As of January 2025, CIPS links over 4,800 banks across 185 countries. Think about that number. 185 countries. That is not a fringe experiment. That is near global coverage for an alternative payments network that operates entirely outside U.S. oversight. Russia has its own system called SPFS, which already has 159 foreign participants across 20 countries. India has its unified. Let that sequence sink in. The infrastructure for a parallel global financial system, one that routes around the dollar, routes around SWIFT, and routes around American oversight, is not theoretical. It is being built and tested right now. Now, let's talk about the sheer scale of the economic bloc driving this. BRICS originally stood for Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. In January 2024, it formally expanded to include Egypt, Ethiopia, Iran, and the United Arab Emirates. Partner nations now include Algeria, Nigeria, Malaysia, Thailand, Kazakhstan, Belarus, Bolivia, Uganda, and Uzbekistan. BRICS plus nations now represent over 40% of the global population and roughly 30% of global GDP. They control 43% of the world's crude oil production and 32% of global natural gas output. When economists at major institutions model forward projections, BRICS Plus could account for close to half of global GDP by mid-century, while the G7's share may fall below 20%. This is not a club of struggling economies trying to get a seat at the table. This is the table being rebuilt somewhere else. And here's the rehook you need to sit with for a moment, because this is where it connects directly to your life as an American. The dollar's reserve currency status is not just an abstract geopolitical concept. It has a direct, tangible impact on every American's standard of living. Because the world demands dollars, the U.S. can borrow cheaply. Because the U.S. can borrow cheaply, it can run $1.8 trillion deficits without an immediate crisis. Because foreigners need dollars for trade, there is permanent global demand for those dollars, which keeps inflation lower than it otherwise would be and keeps interest rates more manageable than they otherwise would be. Economists estimate the U.S. derives somewhere between $100 to $150 billion annually in direct economic benefits just from dollar seigniorage, the privilege of issuing the world's reserve currency. That is before you count the indirect subsidies to American borrowing costs. Now, what happens when that demand starts shrinking? When fewer countries need dollars to buy oil? When more trade settles in yuan, rupees, and rubles? When SWIFT gets bypassed by CIPS and BRICS Pay? The answer is not comfortable. Rising interest rates, a weaker dollar, more expensive imports, higher inflation. The cost of servicing that $98 trillion debt becomes even more brutal. And the structural advantage that has allowed America to essentially export its inflation to the rest of the world for 50 years. That advantage contracts. In 2022, 97% of trade among Shanghai Cooperation Organization nations, a bloc that includes Russia, China, India, Iran, Pakistan, and 6 Central Asian states, was conducted in local currencies, not dollars or euros, not 50%, not 75%, 97%. That number represents a fundamental rewiring of trade flows across a massive portion of the global economy, and almost nobody in the average American household has heard it mentioned once. The most important thing to understand about this monetary reset is that it does not require a dramatic crash or a single explosive event. The most dangerous version of it is exactly what is already happening. A slow, steady, structural erosion. Each local currency, deal signed. Each ton of gold added to a central bank vault. Each new CIPS connection. Each BRICS expansion. These are not individual news events. They are chapters in a single story. And the story is about what kind of world comes after dollar hegemony, and whether America is preparing for it or sleepwalking into it. The dollar is not going to disappear tomorrow. Let's be precise about that. It still dominates 88% of foreign exchange transactions. It still underpins most commodity pricing. It still has no credible single replacement currency. But dominance and permanence are not the same thing. Sterling was once the world's reserve currency. It didn't collapse in a day. It eroded over decades. And when the erosion crossed a tipping point, the adjustment for Britain was sharp, painful, and permanent.